Hello, pleasure to be here. Un poco más bajo. Para los que hablan en castellano, si tienes cualquier duda, puedes preguntar, pero la mayoría de la presentación sería en inglés. Entonces, pero si tienes preguntas, me paras y ya puedo. Pero bueno, voy a seguir en inglés. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about the future roadmap of Grails 2.3 and 3.0. So on the agenda today, we're going to look at a little bit of a retrospective of what happened in the year, like with 2.1 and 2.2. And then we're going to talk about what's coming in 2.3 and 3.0, and also have some time for questions. So, in terms of the state of the nation, we're seeing still significant and progressive growth. Lots of excited devs, Groovy and Grails devs out there, developers. We're seeing significantly more traffic at the conferences. You guys are testament to the audience that we have for Groovy and Grails. But not just here at Grails Exchange in London, there were 25% more developers at the conference, and at the Spring12GX in the US, which is the main US conference for Groovy and Grails, we had 40% more. So it was really a lot of growth in terms of conference traffic. Plugins as well, the community continues to grow. We now have a really good system for approving and regulating the flow of plugins, and we have nearly 900 plugins. I reckon we'll probably hit 1,000 this year. Plugin community keeps growing, and we issued loads of releases last year. There was, I think, 16 or so releases in total that we did on the 2.0x line, the 2.1 line, and 2.2. And we had some pretty exciting plugin developments. So there's some pretty exciting new plugins around. There's the Platform Core, Events Push, the NoSQL plugins, MongoDB, and yes, even some Maven love. So yeah. So yeah, exciting stuff, Maven, yeah. And also we launched a new website, so I suppose most of you have seen it by now, the new website that launched. So is it better? Is it better than the last one? Yeah, I think so, no? It's a big improvement. So it's all open source as well, so if you want to contribute and enhance the website, you can do that yourselves. If you have a thing you're really missing out on that you really like to see the website offer, you can just check out the source and contribute. There's a great area to contribute, and in fact the new site has a lot of external contributions from the community, so we really appreciate that. The whole testimonials area, the initial cut of the design, and in fact the entire design is a community contribution, so we're really excited about that. And yeah, I think it's a better showcase for what Grails is. And the plugin portal is much improved as well. So let's talk about what happened with Grails 2.1, which is one of the main releases last year. So one of the big things in Maven 2.1 was the new Maven plugin. Grails is actually now usable with Maven, which is good. So if you're familiar with the Maven build tool, when I'm talking about usable with Maven, I'm talking specifically with the Maven build tool. We now have we did a big migration project to migrate the plugin repository. And at the time, it's probably even bigger now, but at the time, the plugin repository was like nearly 4 gigabytes of data. So we had to migrate that all over to a Maven compatible repository using a Maven layout, and there were a lot of plugins that didn't have POM files. We had to generate them from the plugin metadata. It was a big project to get that all migrated, but it's all there now. So at repo.grails.org/Grails plugins, there is that's where you will find the Grails plugin repository. It is graciously hosted by the kind folk at JFrog, who many of you know have a product called Artifactory, which is a very good repository manager. So check that out if you're interested. And with the new Maven plugin, you can essentially define all of your dependencies within the POM. So even your plugins, you can define them inside your POM file. And Maven takes complete responsibility for the resolution. So in the prior version, for example, half of the dependencies were resolved by Maven, and then the other half were resolved by Ivy. The plugins were resolved by Ivy, and that caused issues because you could get duplicate dependencies and conflicts and so on. Now, of course, because everything is resolved by Maven, conflict resolution happens correctly, you don't get duplicate jars, and in general, it's just a better experience. We also integrated Maven into the command line, so you don't have to figure out this weird Maven artifact command to write in Maven if you want to just get started. If you have Grails installed, which is getting easier and easier nowadays thanks to GVM. Who's used GVM? Anybody? For those who haven't used GVM, install GVM. It is really good to manage your Grails versions. And also with the Grails Wrapper as well, which I'll talk about soon. It's really easy to set up Grails nowadays. So, and from Grails, you can create a POM file for your project and then directly run Maven package on it or Maven test or whatever, and it just works. And we also added an ability to create multi-module builds. So there's a new project called Create Multi-Project Build. And so if you create several an application and several plugins, and then run Grails Create Multi-Project Build and give details of what the parent POM is, it'll set up a Maven multi-module build for you. So it'll build your plugins and your project together, so Maven can drive that, which is pretty handy. It's quite likely that in Grails 2.3 you'll be able to achieve the same thing with Gradle. We are working with the Gradle guys to be able to support Gradle for the Grails create multi-project build command. So it'll create you a Gradle build with the Grails plugin for Gradle installed, and you'll be able to set it up. It's not the full project that we're taking on to migrate the whole Grails build to Grails 3. Obviously, that's in Grails 3 terms. But it is, it's quite likely in Grails 2.3 there will be some Gradle integration. And also in the new Maven plugin is so previously every command you ran with Maven, it embedded Grails within the Maven process. And that was problematic because it meant that the Maven class path leaked into the Grails class path. And also it put strain on the Maven process. So now all command execution in the Maven plugin is forked. So you basically can specify whether to use forking. So basically it'll spin up another Java virtual machine where it will execute the various Grails commands within the context of the Java virtual machine. So compilation and testing are all forked into a separate JVM, and thus not putting strain on the Maven process. We had a lot of Jira reports from Maven users saying, oh, I'm getting out of memory exceptions or permgen issues, and you have to go and tweak your Maven options. And now you don't have to do that. You can control it within your configuration. There's ways to control how much memory and so on gets allocated. So it's a much cleaner separation between the two, between the Maven build tool and the Grails framework. So new in 2.1 as well is the cache plugin. Is anybody using the cache plugin yet? Few hands? Yeah. Good. Okay, so the cache plugin is basically it provides a set of annotations, such as cache evict, cacheable, and so on. And you can put these on services, for example, and with the name of the cache, and then it will automatically cache those responses. And by default, the default cache used is like a LRU concurrent hash map. But you can install other plugins to, if you want to use EHCache, or if you want to use Gemfire, or if you want to use Redis, you can install other cache managers. So, and you can also, so what actually happens when you do this, just to be more specific, is the argument to the method is used to calculate the cache key. So the cache key is calculated from the method, the cache name, and that title argument which is passed in. So there's no need to specify hard code, get this object from the cache using this key. If it doesn't exist, do the retrieval, put it in there, which is really repetitive logic, which is quite annoying to write. And the same thing can happen on controllers. So on a controller, you can put the cacheable annotation on a controller action. And this is different because this is actually cache the entire response. So if you want to cache the entire response of a request, you put them on a controller action. And then the entire generated HTML or XML, whatever you're generating at the end, gets cached. Yeah? So when you annotate on a service, it only caches the response of the method. But when you annotate on a controller, it'll cache the entire response from that's sent to the browser. And the typical pattern that you use is on the kind of read actions, you put cacheable, and then on the write actions, so anything that updates your data, you put cache evict. So it flushes the cache, and then you get the latest data. Yeah? So that's a typical pattern that you use when using the cache plugin. Also in the cache plugin, there's a bunch of cache tags. There is one called cache block, which will basically cache a block of markup. So a portion of markup. And this is interesting because notice I'm not specifying a key to use to cache. So what it actually does is it uses Groovy's quite useful feature of using a unique ID for each closure in a class. So it uses the closure ID as the cache key by default. And since GSP's each tag is a closure, you get implicit caching happening. If you want to specify a key, you can, but just remember, if you specify the same key on different pages, you can get the same data appearing unexpectedly in places that you wouldn't necessarily expect it to be there. So be careful when specifying your own keys, make sure they're unique across pages. Cache block will deal with that for you by using the closure ID. There's also a cache render. And this is the same as the render tag in Grails for rendering templates, just using the cache namespace. And so it takes the same arguments, it delegates these arguments to the actual render tag, normal render tag in Grails, and then just caches the rendering of the template. It's all very useful. So as I said, there's a core plugin, which is grails.org/plugin/cache. And then there's various implementations. And we anticipate that there will be more implementations in the future. But the current implementations are EHCache, Redis, and Gemfire. But I expect the community will probably come up with cache, XYZ, whatever caching implementation there is. And it's also Grails 2.0 compatible. So if you're still using Grails 2.0, then you can install it as well, and there's no problem. Another cool thing that it has that I didn't mention is it has a cache configuration DSL. And this was an important feature that we wanted to add because it's a DSL that's not tied to any caching implementation. Yeah? And this is important because from a plugin developer's perspective, if your plugin needs a cache, you don't want to require your plugin to depend on EHCache or to depend on Gemfire, because then you're tying your plugin to a particular cache implementation. So there's a generic DSL where your plugin can specify its requirements for a particular cache, and then your application, which uses that plugin, can actually install the concrete implementation for whether it be EHCache or whatever. Yeah. Also in Grails 2.1, shamelessly stolen from Gradle, we have the Grails Wrapper. So you type the Grails Wrapper command and it generates a bash script or a .bat file in Windows in the root of your project, which is Grails W. And that will allow you to essentially run Grails without having Grails installed. It's useful because you can check the wrapper into version control, And then you can ensure that across your project, everybody is using the same version of Grails. Because instead of using their local version of Grails, they just use Grails W to run the application. And it also means that if you can run and build Grails on a CI server without having to actually install Grails on the CI server. Yeah? You just point your CI at Grails W, and it does the rest. You know, Grails W will download Grails in the background, install it, set it up, and you don't have to think about the installation part of Grails. And command aliases. So if you frequently use really long commands, you can alias them. So you can create an alias. For example, this is run integration tests, RIT, and then you can I can define an alias for that command, and then you can just run it, Grails W RIT. It's much easier and shorter and more concise. Okay, so that's 2.1. Now let's talk about 2.2. So 2.2 was released just before Christmas in December. And it's the first Grails release with Groovy 2. So all that good stuff that Cedric was talking about that is available in Groovy 2 is available in Grails 2.2. So static compilation and so on. It's all there in Grails 2.2. So you get access to things like add type checked, add compile static. Groovy is more modular in 2.0. And of course, the first implementation of invoke dynamic. Obviously, there's a lot more in 2.1, and 2.1 support is coming soon. But Grails 2.2 is currently where it's at if you want Groovy 2. Also, we implemented support for namespaces. So a lot of plugin developers don't want, are worried about conflicts that can potentially happen. If you have, say you have two plugins, and both of them provide a user service, yeah? Then it's kind of the last one that loads wins in prior versions of Grails, which may be problematic. So in 2.2, if you have a, for example, person service class, it becomes basically a bean called foo plugin, where this is the name of the plugin, person service. So we used the name of the plugin to namespace the bean. If no other person service exists in your application context, then it also defines a person service bean. It aliases it, yeah? So there's always a way to get access to your services because they're namespaced by the plugin name. Domain classes as well. So in prior versions of Grails, if you have two plugins and both of them define a domain class called person, then you get one table called person, and both of them try to get to it, and maybe they have different schemas, and you run into problems, and you either have to disable automatic DDL creation and map them specifically. It all gets really complicated. So in Grails 2.2, you can configure Grails so that basically it puts the plugin name as a prefix to the table, and you can control how this prefix is generated. So you don't necessarily get conflicts between plugins when installing them in your application. In controllers as well. Now, in the URL mapping DSL, you can actually now link to a specific plugin. So if there's two controllers called person controller, in your URL mappings, you can actually tell Grails which one to map to using the plugin argument, of the URL mappings DSL, which didn't exist before. The same thing with links. So in the glink tag, you can actually specify which plugin you want to link to, and the correct link will be calculated. Yeah? So prior to that, those arguments were not supported. Also new in Grails 2.2, we have the first implementation of fork mode which is basically a way to execute your running application in a completely separate JVM, yeah, Java Virtual Machine. So when you do Grails run app, it'll load Grails in a separate Java Virtual Machine from the actual Grails command line. So prior to Grails 2.2, we loaded the Grails application in the same JVM. This caused problems because the build dependencies leaked into your application. Yeah, so the same class path could be shared. Yes, there are ways to isolate it, but using class loaders. But I think it's far superior to have a separate JVM fork to control these things. The advantages are things like reduced memory consumption. You get to isolate your build and runtime class paths. And another thing you can do in 2.2, which wasn't possible in prior versions, is you can actually deploy other Grails applications in parallel. So inside your build config, you can configure forking by enabling it, and then if you want to deploy another application in parallel, there's a new auto-deploy directory. You just drop your WAR file in there, and it could be another Spring app, it could be another Grails app, and it'll run in parallel to your currently executing Grails application. If you have more, if you need to customize the fork JVM properties, then inside build config as well, instead of just saying true, you can assign a map with arguments of how much memory you want to allocate, what the minimum memory you want, whether you want to load the JVM in a debug state, so you can connect to debugger, and if there's any additional JVM arguments you want to pass, you can control it all from there. And of course, because it loads in the background now, there is a new stop app command to stop the background Java virtual machine. Yeah? And another important aspect about this is if you do Grails space run app, it starts the container in the background. Yeah? So you don't see any errors in the console. You only see them in the browser when developing. So if you want to see errors in your console, you need to use Grails interactive mode. So you start Grails, instead of doing Grails space run app, you start the Grails interactive mode by just typing Grails. And then from interactive mode, you type run app. And then interactive mode will monitor the background JVM for errors and show them in the console. Yeah? But otherwise, it's the same experience. That's the only real difference. As I said, you can auto-deploy additional WAR files to the background Tomcat. So previously, this was not possible because if your different WAR file used a different version of Spring, or if it used a different version of Grails, then you would get conflicts and your application would fail to start. Now you can actually specify in build config an auto-deploy directory where you've got any other WAR files, and it will load those WAR files into your background Tomcat container, and you can run two applications in parallel. Yeah? So yeah, as I said, the additional WAR files can use different versions of Spring or Grails or whatever, and there's no problems with leaking dependencies. Okay, so that is Grails 2.1 and 2.2, which we released throughout last year. And in fact, Grails 2.0 came out last year as well, but it seems so far away now that I didn't bother talking about it, especially with 45 minutes. But does anybody have any questions about those Grails 2.1 or 2.2 so far? ¿Algunas dudas? No? ¿No tienes? Vale. Muy bien. Okay, now we're going to talk about the future roadmap, which I have 20 minutes to do. So, some of the things that we got in front of us, we want to modularize Grails more. We want to improve the REST support, the namespace support, which came in 2.2, more GORM for NoSQL, multi-project builds, async and profiles. There's a whole bunch of stuff on the roadmap ahead. Yet, in terms of a more detailed roadmap, so these are the darker ones is the ones we've done, Grails 2.1, 2.2, and in 2.3, we're looking at, and I'm going to go into this in a lot more detail, REST, data binding, GORM for REST, async, more Groovy T integration, and then in Grails 3, the Grails support, application profiles, and enhanced type checking. So what's coming in Grails 2.3 then? So who enjoys dependency management with Grails right now? Not many people, probably. So we're trying to improve that situation. So in Grails 2.3, there is a new implementation of dependency management based on Ether. So probably not many of you have heard of Ether, but Ether is essentially the dependency resolution engine used by Maven. So when you use the Maven build tool, it's using Ether to resolve dependencies. Yeah? So in Grails 2.3, Ether is going to be the default engine for resolving dependencies, and not Ivy. You will be able to go back to Ivy if you still want Ivy. You can go back to it and enable Ivy. But going forward, we're going to be using Ether in the 2.3 and beyond line to manage dependencies. Why? It's the greater compatibility with Maven repositories. So Ether has snapshot handling behavior that is the same as Maven. So you can, when resolving snapshots, you won't have the gotchas that you face now with Ivy. It'll be a lot more seamless experience when resolving snapshot dependencies. If there are any POM files that are strangely structured or weirdly structured, right now Ivy can have problems reading those POM files. Ether doesn't have any problems with that, capable of dealing with complex POMs. So Ether is going to give us closer, behavior-wise, dependency resolution to what you get with Maven. Yeah? And we have enhanced dependency reporting. So I'm just going to show you this actually in live because it's worth seeing. So from the Grails console here, I can type dependency report. I'm running the Grails 2.3 snapshots right now, and you get a whole dependency report of all of your build dependencies. So we can see I've got a total of 31 build dependencies. These are the top level dependencies. These are the transitive dependencies. This is my dependency on Tomcat for the build. These are the transitive dependencies of Tomcat. These are my provided dependencies that are needed at development time but not during deployment. So you got the servlet API and Tomcat in there. These are my dependencies I need for compilation. So you got Groovy, all 2.1 RC3. We're behind the times. You've got your various. So you get a complete graph. You get a complete graph of all of your dependencies. This is also rather shamelessly stolen from Gradle, by the way. We like stealing stuff from Gradle. But another thing that you get, and I'm just going to stop my demo application here for a minute. Go away. Is if, for example, I specify a dependency on a version that doesn't exist, so yeah, I'm going to specify a dependency on MySQL, and then I run Grails Dependency Report. Then it's obviously going to, I'm going to have lack of internet, aren't I? Ah, there we go. Okay. So there you go. So you can see my dependency report. I've specified a runtime dependency on MySQL. And you can see that in my dependency report, I can see highlighted in red exactly which dependency failed to resolve. So it's very useful in, when you're looking at a whole graph like that, it can be a bit overwhelming to see a graph like that. So it'll much easier identify which dependency failed to resolve. Okay? So enhanced dependency reporting. In 2.3, we will be forking JVMs by default. So at the moment, by default in 2.2, forking is not enabled. In 2.3, that's going to change. So in 2.3, we'll be forking for testing, for the console, for run app, and possibly even for compilation. So you'll be able to control each process that's forked for the console, for running, for compilation. And the reason that we were going to be able to fork for compilation is in Grails 2.3, we're trying to make it possible so that you can change the version of Groovy that you use with Grails. So if a new version of Groovy comes out, yeah, 2.1.1 or 2.2 or whatever, you can upgrade the version of Groovy used by your installation of Grails. Yeah? And because we fork compilation and we fork run app, you're not forced to use the same version of Groovy as your build system. Yeah? So in 2.3, you'll be able to upgrade your version of Groovy within your Grails application because of the forking. And to make this fast is a challenge. So we're actually doing some clever stuff in terms of starting up a background JVM in reserve for when you run the next command. So if you run test app once, we kick off one JVM to run your tests and another JVM to wait. And then the next time you run test app, the one that's waiting behind runs your tests and kicks off another one to wait, and so on, so that you get these pooling of JVMs behind so that testing is still responsive. Yeah? So this is an important change. Then, I'm going to have to be quick, probably. Data binding, we are rewriting the data binding layer. So current data binding is based on Spring's data binding. We are completely rewriting it. You'll be able to go back to the old data binding mechanism using a configuration flag. But the new mechanism will be the default. And it's going to be easier to customize the data binding process. You'll be able to hook into, when I refer to data binding, I'm talking about binding request parameters to your domain classes, yeah, or to a command object. You'll be able to hook into events. So when a data binding occurs, you can listen to events and maybe implement security or customize what parameters you can listen via events. And you'll be able to plug in different binders in a much more easy fashion than you can now. So if you want to see the proposal about that, that's on the wiki. So yeah, there will be a significant amount of work going into the data binding layer in Grails 2.3. REST improvements. So we're going to implement complete support for all the verbs. At the moment, our REST support is lacking in certain areas. We'll be implementing flexible REST scaffolding so that you can scaffold responses for XML and JSON, and also customize the marshallers a lot easier in terms of how you exposed REST responses. We're going to be implementing a more complete REST client and also GORM for REST. So you'll be able to take a domain class and map it to an endpoint, specify the format, and then save it, and it'll do a put, retrieve it, and it'll do a get, transparently marshalling, retrieving the objects under the covers. And you'll be able to customize the marshalling and unmarshalling process. Yeah? So REST client support is going to be a lot more complete in Grails 2.3. Async. So in Grails 2.0, we introduced some basic support for access to the Servlet 3 async API. It's very low level, so it's not particularly user-friendly, because you have to use the actual Servlet 3 programming APIs, which are not, in my opinion, particularly user-friendly or conducive to asynchronous programming. So we're going to introduce a higher level programming model for handling asynchronous data requests. So for example, in a controller action, you will, instead of just returning the model directly, you can return a closure, and then the framework will transparently handle the invocation of the closure in an asynchronous fashion and returning of the model, resumption of the request, and rendering of the view, all asynchronously without you having to think about how it's managing the asynchronous context, kicking off your own thread, and so on. The framework will actually deal with that. And then we have some ideas around GORM async improvements. So for example, if you want to execute 3 queries, and you want to execute them all asynchronously and then collect the results via a callback, that kind of programming paradigm. This is still very much in the planning phase, but we have some concrete ideas which we'll be expressing very soon in this area. So async programming, more complete support both at the controller layer, but also at the data layer. So for retrieving REST responses, the REST client part, returning promises or futures, collecting the results, rendering the response, possible integration with GPARs, so almost certain integration with GPARs. So, so yeah, a lot more stuff happening around async in Grails 2.3. Upgraded libraries. So in Grails 2.3, we'll be shipping with Groovy 2.1, obviously, Spring 3.2. So we'll be upgrading to the latest version of Spring, the latest version of Groovy. And a much larger piece of work is to split out. There's going to be 2 Hibernate plugins. There'll be a Hibernate 3 plugin, and there'll be a Hibernate 4 plugin. Hibernate 3 and 4 are very different and not binary compatible. Yeah, so we can't just upgrade to Hibernate 4 because it'll break everything, everybody's applications and everything. So we'll probably ship with Hibernate 3 for backwards compatibility, but there'll be a new Hibernate 4 plugin that you can install if you want the latest version of Hibernate and to adapt your application to the latest APIs. Or we might do it the other way around. We might ship with Hibernate 4 and then have instructions for Hibernate 3 users if they're upgrading on what they need to do. So, so yeah, upgrading to the latest version of Hibernate and also the latest version of Tomcat, which is 7.0.35, I think. So upgraded libraries included in 2.3. And that's 2.3. Lots of stuff coming on the roadmap in 2.3. Grails 3, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail because it's still very much in the planning phase. But I'll just talk broadly about what we have on the roadmap for Grails 3. So, Gradle for the build. Our current build system based on Gantt, going out the window. So there'll be a legacy layer for running old Gantt scripts. So, but the main build system part will be in Gradle. So the actual powering of the build, all of the incremental build handling, dependency resolution, everything will be handled by Gradle, compilation and so on. So that's going to take a significant amount more work than what we currently have, and it won't be so much an adapter of Gradle calling into Grails. The integration will be much closer. Work on Grails 3 we anticipate starting sort of the middle of this year. So we're talking about July time frame. Anticipate we will start. Then also application profiles. We're going to be untying Grails from the servlet API. And there will be different, when you create an application, there will be different profiles. So you can create a traditional servlet application. Yeah, like we're doing today, like you used to, and like you almost certainly continue to do. But if you want to create a lightweight application that is not a servlet application, but just for example, a Vertex application or a Netty application, you'll be able to do so with Grails, tying in all those features. And we'll have different packaging architectures for the different profiles. So in one you might create a wall, in another you'll create a jar, a standalone jar that you can just execute. In another, they'll encapsulate packaging, structure, default plugins. A profile is just a whole bunch of stuff that makes an application what it is. If you think about what Grails is now, it's a servlet profile. So you get Tomcat container, you get servlet API, you get a certain amount of plugins that make it what it is, a more traditional CRUD application. But maybe you want to create a single-page web app with a JavaScript front end and a lightweight back end. And that's a completely different type of structure and profile with a different set of scaffolding tools and a different set of build components. So this is going to be a big area of development, probably as big as the Gradle part. And static type checking. So we will integrate more with Groovy static type checkers. So all those static type checking extensions. In Grails 3, we want you to be able to build a fully statically type check application if you want to, or if you're happy with dynamic, then great. And integrate all the great work that's happened around Platform Core plugin, the event model, and yeah, take Grails from what it is now into even more use cases in terms of some of the same use cases that things like Node.js are used for, etc. Vertex is used for, and so on. Because Grails is not just a web framework; it's a whole set of data services. It's a plugin model. It's a runtime. It's a much broader set of things that is not necessarily tied to the servlet API. So yeah, much to come in Grails 3. And I think with that, go through the summary. I won't go through it again because we won't have time for questions. But loads of stuff coming.